In this last lecture on sociolinguistics, we're going to take a look at dialects. So, language varieties that correlate with geographical areas are usually called dialects, and the study of dialects goes back a lot longer than the study of sociolinguistics in general does. So, the study of dialects is called dialectology, and it has a long history. So, this lecture, we're just going to do a very quick survey of some of the dialects of English to introduce some of the concepts of dialectology. So we're going to talk about the idea of Englishes, and then dialects of English, and then we'll focus on Canadian English since that's where we are. So English is a pretty prominent language globally, and it plays different roles in different parts of the world, and these are sometimes referred to as different Englishes. Okay, we can distinguish three different kinds of Englishes. There's English as a native language, English as a second language, and English as a foreign language. So English is a native language. This is a situation that we have in countries where English is the primary language of the vast majority of people. Places like here in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the US. Each of these countries has developed a unique dialect or a group of dialects of English. English as a second language is a situation that we get in a country where English is an important language and it's used a lot, but it's not most people's first language. Right? So maybe it's used as a common language because different parts of the country people use different languages as their first language or the official language. Right? So in these countries, there's going to be a lot of people who fluently speak English and use it on a daily basis, but they don't use it at home. It's not their home language, right? So it's not their mother tongue, even though they speak it. So some places where this is the case, India, Malaysia, Nigeria, Singapore, the Philippines. A lot of these countries have also developed unique dialects of English. So for example, Indian English is a dialect of English. It's not just British English spoken with some kind of accent, right? It's considered to be its own dialect of English. It has its own particular properties. One property, for example, is that the verb reach can be used as an intransitive verb, meaning arrive. So you can say something like, call me when you reach, which means call me when you arrive. That's just one little example of a property of this dialect. And then the third kind of English, English as a foreign language, this is a situation where English may be taught in schools, but it isn't really used much in daily life, especially daily life outside of big cities. So, for example, in China, Indonesia, Japan, lots of Middle Eastern countries, people might learn English in school, but for most people, it's not something that plays a big part in your life. In countries like this, they're not usually considered to have their own dialects of English because English isn't really used, it's not really widespread enough or kind of deeply embedded enough to take on a life of its own, unique to a particular country. So in this class, we're just going to look at the first kind of English, English as a native language. So English as it is spoken in its sort of traditional cultural basis. And even more specifically, we're going to look at some differences between British English and North American English. So thinking of classifying English dialects, there are lots of ways to do this. It really depends on which features you focus on. There's one major distinction between English dialects, which involves what's called rhoticity, which is just a linguistic term that means R-ness, having an R sounds. So almost all dialects of English, the R sound is pronounced when it's followed by a vowel. So in a word like red, pretty much all English speakers pronounce an R there. But when you have an R that is not followed by a vowel, this is where dialects differ. So a rhotic dialect is a dialect that pronounces R. So in words like butter or card, pronouncing that R. And a non-rhotic dialect is a dialect that deletes R's that are not followed by a vowel. So they would pronounce these words as butter and cod, right, without an R. So the older pronunciation is the rhotic pronunciation. Um, the non-rhotic, the pronunciation that drops the R, that's an innovation. It became widespread in southern England in the 1700s, and nowadays the standard pronunciation is in England is to delete the R. So if you look at English dialects, this basic distinction, so the non-rhotic areas, the areas where R has been dropped, most of England, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and parts of the eastern US, especially some dialects in Boston and New York City. Right? Although in those particular areas, it's now standard in Boston and New York City to pronounce the R, the rhotic pronunciation, but there are people who speak without the R. So famous example from Boston, is traditional Boston dialect with dropping the R's, is this sentence, right? Park your car in Harvard Yard. And how would a real Bostonian pronounce this? Something like pack your car in Harvard Yard. And so all those R's after the vowels are gone. Something like that in IPA. If you want an example from New York, so Bernie Sanders, whose roots are in Brooklyn, he often drops his R's, although not always, right, but sometimes. And then the rhotic areas, so the areas where the R's have been retained. So most of North America keeps R. Also southwest England, so area places like Dorset, Somerset, Devon. Um, Scotland and Ireland also keep the R. So then, why does American English keep the R? Right. So if you think about historically, colonization of North America by the British started in the 1600s, and at that point, everyone still had their R's. Right. So British English was still rhotic, R's hadn't been dropped. Okay, so the R was brought over to North America by the colonists. Then after that, in the 1700s, the loss of R began. Okay, and London was the focal area for this, of course, right, being the major city. So this new non-rhotic pronunciation that would eventually become standard British English, it's really started in London. It spread pretty easily to most of England, right? Although not to the southwest area where that R is written on the map, right? The change never made it out there. But the Atlantic Ocean, obviously a pretty significant boundary, especially in those times, right? There wasn't really any communication other than people actually physically going to America. Okay, so there was this big boundary, but we did get that leapfrogging effect that the loss of R, it jumped from London to two of the American cities that were very, very important in that time, Boston and New York. Okay. Right, so most of the people, the English speakers in America, had their R, but the new R-less pronunciation spread to Boston and New York. At the time, right? Well, that was prestigious. This was the newest thing out of London, right? And at that time, early enough, people were still looking to London, right, as something positive. So it would have been a marker of status to adopt this new dropped pronunciation. But of course, there came a time when Americans no longer looked to Britain, right? So there was a revolution, and after that point, there was definitely no value in sounding like you were from London, right? So there would be no incentive. So there were these kind of, seeds of R-lessness planted in Boston and New York, but there was no incentive for that to spread, right? So most people in America kept the older pronunciation with the R because at that point, it's better to sound American than British, right? If you really want to assert that you're not British, well, what better way than to sound different? So this is an example of reorientation, right? So the non-rhotic pronunciation originally was prestigious, right? At the time when it was transferred from London, that was a prestige variant. But nowadays, the people who say things like "pak yak had," "have it yad," right? That's considered kind of lower class. That's considered sort of funny way of talking, right? It's exactly the opposite of how it started, right? Because the social prestige that was originally attached to it was lost, and then it was, only certain people who were left saying it. So that distinction between British English and North American English is one of the deepest divides in amongst English dialects. Now, it's not really a matter of two separate dialects because British English and North American English are both cover terms for many different subdialects, okay, which we obviously don't have time to get into. But let's just look at a few other features that distinguish these two dialect areas, British English and North American English. So we can think of lexical differences. This is when we have different words, right? So you think about, right? We North Americans say elevator, in Britain it's a lift. Garbage is rubbish. Gasoline in North America is petrol. A diaper in North America is a nappy. Bangs, right? The hair hanging on the forehead in North America is called a fringe in Britain. A flashlight in North America, in Britain it's called torch. Math in North America, not very different, but in Britain it's called maths. Okay? Short for mathematics, right? So that's where the S is there. We drop it in North America, they don't. The Mohawk hairstyle, in Britain that's called a Mohican. Okay, so it's a name of a different nation. Um, Panties in North America, knickers in Britain. Right? That's a word that makes people giggle over here because it sounds so incredibly British. Thinking about lexical differences, so there's certain places where there's kind of systematic differences. So the vocabulary used for cars and railways is really, really different in the two areas. So this thing is called a truck in North America, but a lorry in Britain. This area is called a trunk, right, but in Britain called the boot. This is called the hood. The thing that you lift up is called the hood in North America, but the bonnet in Britain. I think some Canadians also say bonnet, but in general you hear hood. These two styles of shapes of a vehicle, we call it a sedan and a wagon in North America. It's called a saloon and an estate in Britain. Right? So lots of different vocabulary there. And then for railways, right? So this vehicle, North Americans call it a streetcar or a trolley. British people call it a tram. These would be two in North America, two cars of a train, right? But in Britain, two coaches or carriages. And this moving track that lets the trains go back and forth between two different tracks is called a switch in North America and points in Britain, right? So a lot of variation. And why does it make sense that the vocabulary for cars and railways is different in the two dialects? Well, it's just a historical fact. If you think about when English was transplanted from Britain to North America, it was before any of this existed, right? So automobiles and railways were invented after English had already been given its second life in North America. Right? So then none of these words existed, and what happened is that British people made up new words for these new things, and North American people also made up new words for these new things, and there's no guarantee that it was the same new words in two places.